week 9 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few quarterbacks I would drop this week. The first guy, Jameis Winston of the New Orleans Saints. So Winston, he left that ball game in week 8 versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and it didn't look good. His knee buckled, and he was horse collared as well on that play. So Winston, he got off to a decent start in that ball game, 56 passing yards, a touchdown, 4 rush attempts for 40 yards as well. The ACL out for the season, obviously, but I think he was having a pretty decent season before he went down with the injury here. 170 passing yards, 14 touchdowns, only 3 interceptions, which is surprising to me. He's usually a turnover machine and a rushing touchdown and a fumble loss with that knee injury. And next year, hopefully, he comes back and better than ever, Jameis Winston, if it's for the season. So right now, he's still owned in 41% of leagues, but manages a quickly drop in Winston after we saw him go down with the injury. The next quarterback I would drop is Teddy Bridgewater of the Denver Broncos. So Teddy Bridgewater, he didn't look good at all, in my opinion, in a beefy matchup versus the Washington football team that gives up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And he only finished that game in week 8, 213 passing yards, a touchdown, and only 1 rush yard. And now in week 9 here, he's got a pretty tough matchup versus the Dallas Cowboys. That their defense this season, they're rallying, they're getting things going, and they're making plays, even though we've seen quarterbacks have good fantasy days versus them, giving up the 7th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. But Teddy Bridgewater is hard to rely on right now, in my opinion. And he was a 1-week ad as well, like I mentioned, versus Washington, and he didn't have a big game like I expected him to. So right now, he got added in 10% of fantasy leagues over the last week because of the matchup with Washington. But right now versus Dallas, I could see him having a good game, but he's still a guy I definitely can't trust as a starting quarterback, especially in 1-start quarterback leagues. 2-quarterback league for buys and injuries, you might have to start him, but in the basic fantasy leagues, he's easily a quarterback I would drop in the third and final quarterback, Sam Darnold of the Carolina Panthers. So Sam Darnold, running the football too much, finally caught up to him. And he took a few big hits in this ball game versus the Atlanta Falcons, but he took a devastating one that concussed him, and obviously he was wobbly getting off the field. So Darnold in that game, 129 passing yards and 66 rushing yards in that game. But Darnold, the last 3-4 weeks, we really haven't seen much out of him anyway. Week 5 versus Philly, 8 fantasy points. Week 6 versus the Minnesota Vikings, 17 fantasy points. Week 7 at the Giants, 2 fantasy points. And week 8 Atlanta, 11.76 fantasy points. And next week they verse a pretty decent New England Patriot defense that pretty much held down for the most part Justin Herbert and that Los Angeles Charger offense. So right here, Sam Darnold, he's not looking good to play in the game. And even if he does, I don't like the matchup at all. And right now, fantasy owners dropped him in 28% of fantasy leagues between weeks 7 and 8. But right now, I think he's going to be dropped even more with the injury and the lack of production in the last month. So that's a few quarterbacks I would drop here in week 9 of the fantasy football season.